A lot of small business owners, entrepreneurs think of insurance as a negative thing. And they found that they had an opportunity to reposition insurance as really kind of a launch pad for businesses that you feel because you feel secure with that insurance, you can take more risks. And so they came up with this idea of get going, which became not only the strategic foundation, but the tagline for the brand. One of the projects in here is AC Milan, a football team, where the agency decided that logo is too famous. It's got too much history to touch it at all. And so they didn't touch it. And they built a visual system around that logo to make the brand feel fresh. Swiffer is one that is great, which is another example of something that literally was meaningless. It's not a real word, it was made up. And yet it's kind of not meaningless because it borrows letters from other words that, at least in English, are very familiar. A lot of SW words, sweep, swoosh, have to do with kind of moving effortlessly. And so putting that at the beginning gives you that feeling of kind of sweeping something up. There are 100 names that you could call your son or daughter, and they'll be fine in life. Similarly, for a company, they'll grow into that name that you give them. And so while there are certainly some big mistakes you could make, as long as you're not making one of those really big mistakes, which tend to be kind of obvious once they've been pointed out to you.
If you were to devote the rest of your life to philanthropy, what cause would you choose?
Putting an end to gun violence, which really is apt given what you're pointing at me right now.
Hello, fellows. Welcome to the next episode of Jagged with Just Ravi. Conversations at the edge with thought leaders from the branding, marketing, and the business world. Conversations that ignite new ideas. Ideas with rough and sharp edges, as you will see. Welcome, Rob. Great to have you on my show.
Thank you, Just Ravi. I'm happy to be here.
Hey, and you said my name perfectly.
Well, I got a practice round before we started recording.
Yes. So, taking your first book in context, Designing Brand Identities, which you've co-authored with Alina Wheeler, 6th edition. When you were co-authoring, what did you feel had to be included because the conversations around branding have evolved? What was your lens? And since this book has 50 case studies, which is like, wow, if you had to pick a couple that you feel would be most valuable to today's branding professionals, where would you start?
Alina had always had, dozens of case studies in the third section of this book. It's a three-part book. The first part is sort of basics and fundamentals and definitions. The second part is process, so taking you through step by step how branding works, how it's done. And then the third part has always been, since the first edition, these case studies. And this was the first time in the 6th edition that we decided, let's get rid of every case study from the last edition and get all new case studies, which was quite an undertaking because that involves reaching out to over 50 agencies or companies that have done branding or rebranding work. One of the projects in here is AC Milan, a football team, where the agency decided that logo is too famous. It's got too much history to touch it at all. And so they didn't touch it. And they built a visual system around that logo to make the brand feel fresh and to give it a lot more flexibility and to do all these strategic things that the company and the team wanted to do without touching the logo. And I think those are the kinds of things that I hope and think people learn the most from, is seeing the more nuanced side of branding, that it's not always just about a new logo.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. Let's start talking about how do you define a brand identity?
Well, so I think identity, brand identity, and to some degree just brand in general, you can think of it in a few different ways. And when we talk about brands, a lot of times we as strategists and branding professionals, we talk about the ideas that sit behind the brand. So what does this brand stand for? You mentioned purpose, which is one way of thinking of it. It can be more pragmatic than that. It can just be, where does this brand fit into your life? Why does it matter to you as a potential customer? What's better about this brand than that brand? And that's, what we talk about when we do positioning work a lot is how are we different? How are we better? Where do we sit in the market versus that other brand? Maybe we're the premium version and they're the more economical version of whatever product. And so that's the idea part of branding. The next thing I like to think about is identity, which is when you take those ideas and you just express them, usually pretty consistently across every single touch point. And a touch point is just any place that you might interact with the brand. Place is maybe the wrong word. Any way that you might interact with the brand. And a useful way to think about that is looking across the five senses. So a lot of it is visual. We always think about logos, but there's also just what are the colors of the brand? How does the brand move on the screen if it has animation or characters? Some brands have, a little Geico gecko or a little cartoon character associated with them. So all of those are touch points. But then there are also verbal touch points. What's the name? Does it have a tagline? How do they sound? Do they have sort of a unique voice or personality that comes across in the way they write or the way people narrate during their radio ads? And then, yes, some brands more than others have a smell or a taste or a tactile feeling. And of course, that it's easier to think about that when you're thinking about maybe hospitality, where you walk into a hotel and you can really feel that you're in one brand of hotel, one chain of hotels versus another, because not only do you see the name and the logo, but the music they're playing in the lobby, the smell that they have in the lobby, the feel of the sheets on the beds in their rooms is just different. Maybe it's better, maybe it's different than some other hotel chain. So all of those are touch points as well. And yeah, we write about identity in that very inclusive, holistic way. We break it down a little bit. Of course, we do talk a lot about visuals. I'm not a designer, which made it kind of funny for me to be writing a book where the first word in the title is designing. But really, this book is not just about design in that sort of graphic design, visual sense. It's about designing an entire experience, an entire brand, and creating it from scratch and then maintaining it over time. And it gets into a lot of the business implications of that, not just the aesthetics. A lot of times, the only thing you know about a brand is the name. The first time a friend mentions to you, have you heard of blank? And it's a new cool shoe brand or something. It's not like you're seeing the logo when they ask you that. You're just hearing the name. And so it's a hugely important aspect of how brands are perceived.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. As you were talking about the identity, and there were certain names popping up in my mind. The laughing cow, because I just worked on the brand, how there is a character which has become so iconic, but it's just started with the idea behind the brand. It could just so succinctly present what it stood for, even the personality, the boldness, the laughter, the nurturing, and the purity, the quality, everything. So and in India, there are a lot of brands where the music plays a very important role. If you see
Sure.
how our Bollywood is, how our
Yes.
movies are, most of the movies are musicals. So
Great music in India, so I'm not surprised to hear that.
yeah. And how behavioral science started talking about that for the brand to be memorable, it's the emotion and the music, that forms those
Yes.
structures so beautifully. So Zomato and MasterCard, this whole sound signatures has been taken
Right.
very seriously across touch points, even, in your online, every time you do a transaction, like Zomato is a food delivery service. So every time you do a transaction, every time you search, there is a small part of the sound signature, so that cumulatively it's always trying to take on a very distinct association. Now, Rob, what are the challenges? Like you talked about strategy, and you always advocate that this entire exercise must be fueled by very, very sound, strategy brief. Uh, do you have an example in mind?
Before I get there, I want to just uh, link back to some things you were saying. These characters like Laughing Cow, there is research that they seem to be really memorable aspects of brands, and that research has been shared a lot online. And so I think we're seeing more and more brands create them, even in less expected spaces. So you see it a lot in uh, food and beverage. You see it less in B2B, and yet I think we're starting to see more willingness to at least explore that as an idea, having some little cartoon character or computer animated character that's in ads, even for things that are sort of thought of as more boring industries. It's a way for them to be less boring and potentially more memorable. And the Geico Gecko is an example of that, if you're familiar with the gecko.
Yes.
Um, so I think that's sort of a trend that we're seeing a little bit more of that. In terms of strategy, a big it's debatable whether you consider it part of strategy, but the first phase of branding work in most processes, and certainly the one in designing brand identity, is just conducting research. And so you can think of that as coming before strategy, or you can think of that as sort of being part of strategy, is just doing your homework, knowing what your competitors are doing, knowing, most importantly, probably what customers think, who they are, what they're looking for. And so a lot of these brands and rebrands that are in this book, you can tell that they're really heavily informed by research. So, I mean, we can talk about Campbell's, for example, um, which is a somewhat subtle evolution of the logo and the packaging for that famous soup can and everything else that they make. I wasn't involved in the process, but the case study, helped write the case study that's in this book and talked to Turner Duckworth, the agency who did the work. And so much of that is about understanding how much room the brand has to change. And because that's such a famous uh, visual identity, I mean, it's been memorialized by pop art in the 60s, and just like it's been around for so long, they obviously didn't want to change it much. But to figure out exactly how much they could change or should change, what signal those changes would send to customers, um, that's strategy. That's research and strategy, and it really kind of links up very tightly with design. And I'm sure that Turner Duckworth was doing. Their designers were working hand in hand with people who were doing research and strategy to make sure that they were pushing things in the right direction and that they were pushing things far enough, but not too far to make a business difference, but not to do what we have seen some other brands do, which is change things too much. All of a sudden, customers have trouble recognizing them on the shelves, think they look like somebody else, literally just pass them on the shelves, can't find the brand they're looking for, and sales decline. And so there's really no risk of that happening with this Campbell's rebrand. I've seen it in stores locally. And even knowing the case study, it takes a second to check the can and say, okay, this is the new logo versus the old logo. But overall, the impression it gives is very refreshed, very much, it's more modern, it's cleaner, it's simpler. And so it's helped achieve a lot of things that I think Campbell's was trying to achieve. So that's just one example, and I think kind of a subtle example. The bigger, ways that we think of it, there's an example in the book, not a case study, but on the brand strategy page of work by Collins for, let me actually turn to the page in here and we can, I don't know if I can hold it up to the screen, but we can just look at it. There's a smaller business to business insurance company called Next. And the strategy work that they did found that a lot of people, a lot of small business owners, entrepreneurs think of insurance as a negative thing. It's the thing that it's a necessary evil. You don't want it, but you have to pay for it because what if something bad happens? And they found that they had an opportunity to reposition insurance as really kind of a launch pad for businesses, that you feel, because you feel secure with that insurance, you can take more risks. You can do things that you might be afraid to do otherwise. And that's so important to entrepreneurs and small businesses, to be able to extend themselves and push themselves. And so they came up with this idea of get going, which became not only the strategic foundation, but the tagline for the brand is this idea of get going, push yourself further. And that went into all kinds of illustrations for the brand with, there's a really small image here, but I'll try holding it up of, yeah, it's a little blurry, but a little guy on a rocket ship, right? So
Mm.
this idea of insurance sort of being that metaphorical rocket ship for the business, it all came out of the strategy, but you almost wouldn't know it because it's so beautifully done in the design work that it just feels natural, it feels cool. And so that's the impression you get as a potential customer is just, oh, this brand feels fresh, it feels relevant, but behind the scenes, that's coming from research and strategy work.
Amazing. I think the coolest brands are those that very authentically break a norm within that category.
Mm.
So the kind of conversation change, the kind of reframing that this brand has done, and of course, already there must be some bit of emerging, trend or conversation about, insurance can be useful. Let's look at it like this. But they've kind of latched onto it and they've just started a new conversation.
That idea of doing it authentically, like you said, of really, I think they have to have people at the organization who really believe in that and who are able
Yes.
to do it in the way that doesn't feel like it's fake. And I mean, it really is just like real life, right? You can tell when somebody is trying too hard. They're dressing in a certain way because they want to look, they want to try to pretend to be somebody they're not. And their confidence is maybe not there because they know that they're sort of faking it as well. And the same thing can happen with brands where you feel like, a lot of the missteps that we see in advertising, it's because they're trying to chase some trend or pretend that they're really, really cool when you know that it's not true. It's just sort of window dressing. It's, we say lipstick on a pig sometimes. I do think sometimes it's easier for smaller companies where that they have smaller teams that really sort of know each other and know themselves, and there's more of maybe a culture there to deliver on it. It gets harder with these bigger, older companies that have so many people that come from so many different backgrounds. Honestly, sometimes it sort of dilutes the original thinking behind the brand, and it's hard for them to really focus down on who are we and what do we want to be, which is of course part of the challenge for branding and brand consultants that come in and help those organizations. But yeah, these authentically cool brands are able to do it.
Yeah, and when you were talking about the smaller companies, I was reminded of one name you mentioned earlier, the sandwich shop. So they clearly define who they are and then they stay on that. But at the same time, the challenge for a Campbell is so different for an iconic
Right.
brand to keep refreshing itself, keep modernizing itself while being very, very careful that the recognition, the familiarity, none of that suffers.
Yeah, there's this famous old sort of meme that went around the design community online of looking at Coca-Cola versus Pepsi and how often they've rebranded over there. They're both um, over 100, maybe 150 years old as brands, as companies. And Coca-Cola, of course, has had that script logo and the red and white color palette for a very long time. Not since they were founded, but almost. Whereas Pepsi famously rebrands every 10 years, sometimes less. And it changes pretty dramatically sometimes. In the 80s, they were all caps. Then in the early 2000s, they went to that lowercase logo. Now they've gone back to the all caps. Um, and, their color palette has changed less, but a bit. And so there's sort of this accusation almost that, or this assumption that the reason Coke is often considered the stronger brand is maybe due to that consistency. I'm not sure how true that is. There are a lot of reasons that one brand might be stronger than another, and there's a causation question here of maybe they're able to stay consistent because they're the leader. But I do think Coke is a great example of a brand that has uh, stayed true to who they are. You always recognize them. There's never a sense that they've completely changed. And yet, if you really look, their advertising changes. They play with their brand codes quite a bit. They take things like the swoosh under the logo, um, like the logo itself, and they'll break it up. They'll, one of their famous ads was taking that sort of swoosh under the logo and making it one hand handing a can of Coca-Cola to another. Apparently, this work was done by a design student in Hong Kong, which is pretty amazing. But that's something that those of us who work in branding would recognize as something that's probably a quote unquote against the rules. If you look at their brand guidelines, don't play with this. Never show that. Never break the words apart in the logo. Never, you never use a different color palette. And yet they're able, because it's such a strong brand, they're able to play with it quite a bit and still have it be recognizably Coca-Cola. So that balance between rigid consistency and fun and playfulness and flexibility and making things really relevant to a specific time or place or customer segment, that's where brand management comes into play of like how much should we move things around. And there are all kinds of different factors that go into answering that question correctly. There's no one true answer for every brand, but I do think striking a balance is usually the answer, somewhere in between the two.
Absolutely. And like you said, I mean, it's the parallel with how you relate to a person. I mean,
Right.
there's certain things you would expect from a person that, okay, they'll reinvent and they'll do a makeover, but you want to have a similar conversation. You don't want to get shocked. You want to get
Right.
surprised. You want to twist to the familiarity, but you don't want to say, who is this person? I don't know this person. What do? I want to run away.
Yeah, I mean, right. We can look at, I'm just thinking of two famous tech CEOs, right? Steve Jobs famously like dressed almost exactly the same every day. He could get away with that level of consistency of basically the same outfit. And it was great because, you could recognize Steve. There are these images of Steve Jobs where you don't really even see his face. It's just the glasses and the black turtleneck, and instantly he's so iconic and recognizable. So that worked really well for him. Then you have another tech CEO, Mark Zuckerberg, who has recently kind of completely redone his look. And I'm drawing a metaphor here between sort of clothing and personalities of people versus brands, but they are sort of brands to a degree. And Zuckerberg has done this big shift, and I think it's debatable, how that's working for him. Um, it's definitely turned a lot of people off. Probably other people think it's like a step in the right direction, that he looks a lot more fashionable now. I don't know which is really true, but it's that same idea. Like it's definitely a big change where you're like kind of like, who is Mark Zuckerberg? Thought I
Yeah.
knew him,
Is this
and now I don't.
authentic enough? Yeah. Is this who
Exactly.
he really is? Yeah.
Right. Whereas Steve Jobs seemed very authentic, whether you love him or hate him. And I do think there were probably things to love about him and to hate about him. He
Yeah.
was very authentic. He was consistent. Um, and yeah, he probably changed through the years. He looked very different, than in the 80s versus the 90s and 2000s. But it was this consistent through line of like, okay, but that's Steve Jobs. We recognize kind of how he looks and how he acts because there's a real core there that you just pick up on. And that is so much of what we're trying to do in branding is just what is that core?
Yeah.
First, like what should it be? Those ideas, that personality, and then how do we keep it consistent through the years while allowing enough change for it to feel relevant, fresh, modern?
Think coming from the point of view of it's a creator economy, right? And Gen Z, we say they're born self-actualizers. They kind of they don't want things to be that rigid and predefined. And
Right.
the way the world is, it gives them that kind of choice and space to explore their own path. So the brands that have an authentic story and they are unabashedly expressing it, the brands that are rich in terms of expression and
Yes.
prolific. So is there anything like that is impacting identities?
There are a couple of trends, at least in visual identity, that pick up on that. So I actually just went to the brand new conference in Salt Lake City, which is an annual conference really focused on the craft of identity design. And so, one of the things we saw there was a an agency called Brethren Design that talked about, they used the term maximalism. And they're one of a couple of agencies that I feel like they really try to deliver a lot of brand assets to their clients. So, which is a counter trend to what's been happening for a long time, which is minimalism. Let's keep it really simple. You have one logo, you have as few colors in your color palette as possible because you want to become known for just that color. Um, and I don't think that's gone. I think some of that thinking is still very important. But this is almost a counter trend of, you can have, yes, maybe one logo, but maybe you have six versions of it, just to have fun. You have variations on the idea. You have little characters. So we talked about characters. Maybe you have not just one gecko, but you have like a little family of cartoon characters that you can play with on your website or in your ads. Um, there's a lot more. Some of it is sort of like skate culture, surf culture coming into branding. And so you see things like stickers and badges that are just where you need to play with the brand to have it be fun. And so I think we're seeing a little bit of that, at least in some spaces, some brands. That coffee or that sandwich shop that I mentioned in California definitely fits into that trend too, where Lincoln Design out of Oregon, who worked with them, also really kind of over delivered. They came up with all these cool like shirts and hats and beer koozies, a lot of merch for this sandwich shop, which you wouldn't think of. Most sandwich shops, you don't feel like you want to buy a t-shirt necessarily, but they made this brand feel so cool with all of this different work, that it does. It feels like a cool brand that you want to become a part of, even though it's just a local sandwich shop. So I
Mm.
think that's one thing we're seeing. I also saw a really interesting trend report type of thing from a designer who, unfortunately, I can't remember his or her name. It was on LinkedIn. I'll try to share it on social media soon, but it was similarly saying that we've moved beyond what they called Chobani core, which is this design movement that was really kind of ushered in by a rebrand of Chobani, which coincidentally is featured in the sixth edition of Designing Brand Identity, um, which again, it was simplicity, but not really minimalism. It brought a lot more humanity and life into the packaging for Chobani. It was less about thin geometric sans serif typography. It brought in these sort of fat, curvaceous letter forms that frankly, felt more like yogurt, which is what Chobani sells so much of. And there was something about it that was so much more appetizing. And that was so successful that it had a big impact on a lot of food and beverage brands. But now what we're seeing is, and I do think this is partly Gen Z driven, we're seeing a lot more sort of bold colors, almost cartoony, thick line, illustration driven identities. And so that's a trend that was identified in this report. And I do think there's some truth to that. Anytime we're talking trends, it's like there's the trend and then there's also the counter trend, or there's a trend, but it's only really affecting one kind of industry or a few related industries. So I don't I don't know how much there's kind of a macro trend driven by Gen Z that's affecting everything in branding, but we are seeing pockets where there's an impact of that generation or just trying to appeal to that generation.
Very interesting. This whole thing about play and yeah, being more human, more alive, more life. Um,
Yeah,
especially
and I think partly it's driven also by technology. It's just the ability to create animated, movement is so much easier. The technology is getting better. The people are getting more talented at a younger age, coming out of school, knowing how to use all the software to create this stuff. And AI is it's really lowering the barrier of entry for people to create cool video content and things like that. And so it's partly just the ability is there to do things we couldn't do before, and so brands are picking up on that.
Um, you also talked about that the naming exercise per se is not given the kind of it's the criticality is not appreciated that much
Mhm.
because like you change the uh, visual aspects of a identity system, you'll evolve it, but Campbell still is Campbell. Coca-Cola
Right,
is
right.
Coca-Cola. I mean, it's I mean, you can't change the name. I mean, Rob
Right.
cannot become somebody else.
Yeah, even Mark Zuckerberg has, I mean, yeah, but to name an
Yeah, I mean,
unfortunate
that
celebrity
would be
right
like
now.
having multiple passports and being in a spy movie, right? I mean,
Yeah.
that's not for regular.
Yeah, I was going to invoke Puff Daddy P. Diddy, who did change his name a lot. I'm sorry to bring him up, given recent, news about him. But some people do change their names, but
Yeah.
most don't, right? So yeah, that's one of the things I say makes naming so important is that if you do it right, it will never change for the life of your brand. Even though your logo might change, your website will change, your advertising will change, everything else is kind of up for grabs. But the name shouldn't change unless something's gone wrong, usually, or there's been a merger or an acquisition or something like that. So it is really, really important. I think most people recognize the importance of it to a degree, um, but they may not recognize how hard it is. And so I think logo design and just graphic design, most people that don't do that are willing to say like, okay, let's leave that to the experts. Like I'm not a designer, I can't draw. People say things like this, and they're like, let's just leave it up to an expert. But with naming, it's just words, right? And we all speak one or more languages. We all use words and read and write every day. And so it's kind of like, how hard can that be? I can come up with a bunch of different ideas. And honestly, it in some ways it kind of shouldn't be as hard as it is. What makes it hard, some of the things that make it hard, one is legal availability. There are just so many trademarks already sort of taken that you might think you would want to call your company this, and yet you find out there's already some other company selling similar things using that name, that it's going to cause legal challenges for you. There are also linguistic challenges that you might not consider. So if you are launching a brand in your home country, but you have aspirations of expanding one day globally or into neighboring countries, you need to know whether your name is going to mean something offensive or be hard to pronounce in those other countries. And then, of course, the internet is really kind of the Wild West still in terms of buying up domains. And so I argue that actually getting your exact .com domain is not as important as people think it is, but finding something that works for your business is going to be really, really hard because unlike trademarks, there's really nothing stopping anyone from just buying a bunch of .com domains and just keeping them forever and hoping that somebody will pay them for them. And so everything's taken kind of. So there are all these hoops that you have to jump through during the naming process that just make it really difficult. And that is one of the things that I think people underestimate when they go to try to create a brand or start their own company.
Yeah, and I'll take this moment to make a case for naming people also a little more seriously, or maybe not too seriously. And my dad named me after a lot of thought. So
Mhm.
it's such a unique name. I mean, I can look at it any which way, but it's such a unique name. Every conversation that I have in India also, people want me to tell how it is spelled, how it's pronounced, and what it
I
means.
see.
Because it's so
Right,
unique. On World Wide Web, you will not find another person with this name. You know,
right.
so so
Which is good and bad,
that's the
right?
other
It's
extreme.
Yeah, no, there are these same tensions in naming companies and products. You want it to be distinctive. So yeah, ideally it doesn't sound so much like every other brand in the space that people can't remember which one was yours, but you don't want it to be so strange that nobody can spell it, nobody knows how to pronounce it, or it's hard to remember because it's so sort of weird, or just like hard to contemplate. So it's always kind of finding, again, I feel like I'm saying this a lot, like finding the balance. Um, And also, you mentioned just seriousness. So I mentioned how important it is and how hard it can be. But I do think, ironic, the flip side of that is that when people are doing naming work, sometimes they do overthink it. They feel like, it has to be perfect and it has to mean something really deep and important about, us and our business. And they'll reject a bunch of perfectly good ideas because they've just gotten too focused and too sort of into their heads about this being the only time to get this right. And so it's a really tough thing for me because I obviously think it's important. I get paid to help companies do this, and so I want them to think it's important. But you can't make it so important that you're sort of paralyzed by fear and you just never move forward. You have to be willing to recognize that a lot of names probably could work fine, just like naming a child. There are 100 names that you could call your son or daughter, and they'll be fine in life. Like
Yeah.
they'll grow into that name, and it's not
Yeah.
going to stop them from living a fulfilling life. And similarly for a company, they'll grow into that name that you give them. And so while there are certainly some big mistakes you could make, as long as you're not making one of those really big mistakes, which tend to be kind of obvious once they've been pointed out to you, there are probably a few different things you could use that would work perfectly fine. The name doesn't even necessarily have to mean anything. Apple is one of the greatest brand names ever, and what does that have to do with computers or phones or really anything? Um, so some names do have meaning, and they're great because of that. Other great brand names are pretty much meaningless, and they work really well because they just sound right, or they evoke a feeling, or they're simple. I mean, so much of what makes Apple great is it's just so easy to remember.
There's an art to it as well, while there's a science to it. I think, as you're saying, that some names will call you and say, "Oh, this is just right." It's just, I mean, I'm saying
Yeah,
one input perhaps, apart from the research, apart from the science, apart from the distinctiveness, apart from the, you know, category codes and other competitive names. There is also um, a, a, an art to it. It pulls you, right? It calls you
sure, sure. Well,
from
so much
your
of what works about
experience.
Apple is just that it was, you mentioned this earlier, it was so like the coolest brands are the ones who can break the trends in an authentic way. And I know we talked about Steve Jobs and Apple a lot, but if you look at the names of computer companies in the 70s and 80s, Apple was ridiculously different. I mean, they were all sort of techie sounding, Compaq with a Q, IBM, of course, International Business Machines. Um, Sounded very formal or corporate or sort of tech sounding. And then comes Apple, which is the simplest, friendliest, most everyday thing. And there are other reasons that he chose that, but it broke the trend, and he was able, him and Steve Wozniak and everyone else who helped found that company were able to do it in a way that felt authentic to the product and the company. Um, other names that I talk about in my other book, which is all about naming, Swiffer is one that is great, which is another example of something that literally was meaningless. It's not a real word; it was made up, and yet it's kind of not meaningless because it borrows letters from other words that, at least in English, are very familiar. A lot of SW words, sweep, swoosh, have to do with kind of moving effortlessly. And so putting that at the beginning gives you that feeling of kind of sweeping something up. So Swiffer just it created an entirely new idea, and they were naming something that was sort of a new product category, so they could do that. Um, the other names that had been considered all had mop in the name, like Ready Mop, and some of the competitors were things like that. And it's so expected that it would have just blended in. But Swiffer really stood out and felt different. Um, and Kodak is another example, another really, really old company, an old name. Um, but that, I suppose, compared to Apple and Swiffer, is even more meaningless because that is a completely made up word that George Eastman, the founder of Kodak, chose because he liked that K sound so much that he wanted it at the beginning and the end, and just made up a word that had that. And so it was available. So there, a lot of it was about availability. He could easily trademark that. Nobody else used anything like it. It was instantly recognizable. It's very short, very easy to pronounce in just about every language around the world because it's just consonant, vowel, consonant, vowel, consonant. And so it sort of ticks off a lot of things that I think make some names strong, even though it doesn't have meaning built into it from day one.
Now, it just came to me now, jagged with just Ravi. What do you think about that
Yeah.
for me?
Well, I'm assuming part of the reason you did it is for the alliteration of the J, which I think is great. Or not the alliteration, but it sort of takes the J from your name. And so it feels like there's a relationship between your name and the podcast name. There's some consistency there. And I think that works really well. Um, I think it's great. It's a familiar word, easy to pronounce, but it doesn't immediately it's not a overused word in the space, right? It's not just marketing something. My podcast is called How Brands Are Built, which admittedly, I mean, it's very. I chose it partly because it does sound like what it is. I wanted something really descriptive. Jagged is not descriptive, but because you've paired it with that tagline, it's evocative. It gives you a certain feeling about what the conversations are going to be like. And there is a story behind it, which I think is really nice as well, which you did such a good job at the beginning of our conversation of saying sharp edges and really kind of, that word sharp, tying it into jagged and giving it some rationale so that the first time people tune in, I don't know if you do that on every single episode, but
I do.
even if this is the first episode they've listened to, they immediately kind of get it. So I think I hope it's working for you. I mean, that's the real test. But I think it has a lot of the qualities that I would look for in a great brand name.
Okay, we'll retake this. Yeah, people do say that this is that there's a uniqueness in the approach and show, etc. So, okay, cool.
Good.
Oh, thank you. Okay, now AI and its impact on how do you think it's all going to evolve?
Oh man, well, I can't predict too much, but it's changing so rapidly. It's getting so much smarter so quickly, which is both amazing and kind of frightening. I do think even Adobe Max just happened, their big conference last week, or maybe it was earlier this week, and they announced a bunch of new tools in their software that take advantage of AI. And I do think that it is somebody posted like there's no more need for junior designers because a lot of the things you would ask a junior designer to do, the AI can just pretty much do now. And so I do think it is going to impact people's jobs in the profession. I think it's going to take some of the busy work that we've had to do, and we'll be able to outsource that to AI instead of other humans, which has negative consequences, but also some hopefully positive ones. It should elevate the level of creativity, hopefully, and allow people to focus more on what are the ideas, what's going to make this resonate more with other human beings. Because brands that are just chasing trends will probably be able to use AI to help them do that because AI should be it should be really, really good at identifying trends and mimicking them. That's sort of what it's built to do in some ways. But brands that, like we've been talking about, that are trying to be unique, that are trying to create their own trends, that are trying to break away from trends, that's still going to rely to a large degree, I think, on human ingenuity. And then executing that, when you get down into the execution work, again, we'll be able to rely on AI a little bit to do some of that. We're seeing that in naming as well. I've written about and interviewed the founder of a company called Monica that's using AI tools to generate names for companies and products. Um, they've found ways to use AI supposedly to do some of the creation of names, but we just spent a long time talking about like the hard part of naming. A lot of it is more emotional, the art part, right? Figuring out what's going to work, what are people going to like. A big part of it for me as a naming consultant is getting a group of people to agree on a name because it is so emotional, and there isn't a right answer necessarily all the time. And so I haven't seen AI that tries to do that yet, that tries to interact with a team of humans and get them to all agree on a single name, which they ultimately have to come up with. So Yeah, I think AI will continue to kind of eat away at um, the things that we do in this profession and probably many other professions, but it is um, sort of working its way up. I think it's able to mimic some of the lower level, less creative, more implementation oriented things that we're doing. I think even after saying what I just said, that we haven't seen it do X yet, every time I say that, I feel like I'll probably look like a fool in about 5 years because it's learning so quickly that it probably will be able to do some of those things. And so I think it's a legitimate question of, what are we humans going to be able to continue to bring to the table as AI gets smarter and smarter and more capable. Um, so right now, yeah, I mean, I think um, it is some of that ingenuity and creativity and divergent thinking. AI really is about convergent thinking. It's about taking the average, figuring out what everyone else is doing. So yeah, I think, I believe, and I hope that that people will still be required for that, and that maybe we'll see more creativity as a result, more interesting, more sort of crazy left turns out of brands and art and other sort of creative exercises, because some of that quote unquote easy work or busy work has been taken off of our plates by AI.
Yeah, I like that you've kept it positive.
Not no, I'm not known for that, but yeah, I think that you can spin it either way. There's a negative and a positive side, just like anything else.
Yeah.
But yeah, I like to try to think about the optimistic side.
Okay.
What have you done?
Well, this was just a demo. Answer the questions quickly, stay rapid,
Okay,
don't elaborate, don't think,
I'll
and
try.
you'll be all right. Let's see how you do. Otherwise, I will have to shoot you. Okay, mother's best advice.
Be safe.
Alternate profession could have been.
Architect. Oh, I wanted to be a special effects guy in Hollywood.
Oh, lovely. What would you do on
That would have been
Mars
cool.
for fun?
For fun, watch the sunset.
One thing no one knows about you.
Just recently became a big fan of table tennis.
Super. A book you'd like to gift to all your friends cannot be your own.
My favorite book growing up and maybe still is Catch 22. So that's one that I would love everyone to read.
What's your favorite childhood memory?
I was just talking to a friend about this yesterday. So I'll say jumping off the swings on the swing set in the playground, riding it all the way to the top and then just letting go and feeling like you're flying for a split second.
Wow, what a visual.
I
Okay,
was I was not taking my mom's advice, I guess. I was not being safe when I did
safe. Okay.
that.
Don't be safe. Okay, if you were to devote the rest of your life to philanthropy, what cause would you choose?
Putting an end to gun violence, which really is apt given what you're pointing at me right now.
I support
It's a
you.
big
I
problem, as you
totally
probably know.
support you.
It's a big problem in my country, hopefully
Yes.
not as much in yours. And so, yeah, it's top of
Yeah,
mind
yeah.
for me.
Hollywood kind
Yes.
of educates us. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Yes.
What is your greatest joy?
It's a cliche, but my kids.
Never a cliche. Okay. How would you like strangers to remember you?
I would like them to remember me for
Yes.
being kind and helpful and generous. I don't know that they will, but that's what
Okay.
I would love.
It's a vision. Yeah. What's a lesson that took you a long time to learn?
I was just talking to my wife this morning about being able to put yourself in other people's shoes and knowing that just because something is very important to you doesn't mean that it is to them. And so we have to be able to make a case for what we believe in,
Mm.
explain things clearly, and not just assume that they will get it or that they will care about it because we do.
Enroll them, sort of. Okay. What is one missed opportunity you wish you could have a second chance at?
Well, the thing that popped in my head, which I guess is the point of this exercise, I've had a few mentors in my career who have passed away. I mentioned Alina as well, and so always am thinking I wish I could have spent more time with them. Um, I think with a lot of them, I did try to do that, so it's not necessarily a regret, but of course, you always wish that you could have
Yeah.
one more. chat, one more lunch or cup of coffee with these people that had such a big impact, or that you felt like were so wise and you wish you could learn more from them.
Yeah.
I can talk about another book that I'm working on. It may already be out by the time you listen. And this is just a fun book that has pretty much nothing to do with branding. So it's called A Bee at Sea, and it has a cartoon on the front of a bee, like a bumblebee, rowing a boat in the ocean. And yet it's spelled with just the letters A, B, the at symbol
Wow.
from email, and then
Okay.
C. And the entire book is done in that way. It's cartoons, and then the captions are just letters and symbols, and you have to decode them. It's like a word puzzle. And I didn't invent this kind of word puzzle. It's been around for a long time. There was a New Yorker cartoonist in the 80s, actually in the 60s, I think he wrote his first book called CDB. So again, about a bee. It's someone pointing to a bee saying "see the bee," but it's just CDB. And I grew up reading his books and loved them, and then thought of a bunch of ideas that were in that same vein but had never been published before, and decided to see if I could write a book that was sort of an homage to his work. And so I partnered with another New Yorker cartoonist, Dan Misdy, who drew all of the cartoons in this. And it's just a fun little book. So yeah, so here's one. It's a mom at an ice cream truck with her little girl standing next to her, and she's getting her ice cream. And underneath it, the caption is the letter U, the number one again, and then the number two with a question mark. So she's saying to her daughter as she gets her ice cream, "You 112." So it's "You want one too?" And so it's just, yeah, lots of puzzles like that that you have to read them a few times sometimes. We got even like the pie symbol in here. So this is somebody eating hot wings, so hot that he looks like Dan drew him as a skull with fire coming out of it. And it says S pi C, the pie symbol, S pi C. So if you read it fast, it's spicy,
Oh
or it's
my God.
spicy. And so this is really the biggest proof, I think, that I'm a word nerd, is that I've written this entire book of word puzzles.
Okay. So it's a wrap up. I will now request you, Rob, to share any online email addresses. How can audiences reach
Sure.
you? Anything else you want to say about the books or any one of the
Mhm.
book? Everything will be there in show notes as well. But yes.
Yeah, so the best place to go to learn about me is my agency is Heirloom, and you can find it at heirloomagency.com, HEIRLOOM agency.com. And from there, you should be able to find links out to social media, things like that. But I'm pretty easy to find, just at Rob Meyerson on most social media, Instagram, LinkedIn. And the one thing I didn't mention about this new book is these are called grammograms. That is the technical name for these weird puzzles. And so if you go to grammograms.com, you'll find a little more information about those and about this book, if that's something that you think would be fun to look at.
Awesome. And designing brand identity and brand names. That book came 3 years back, and designing brand identity has recently come. So
Earlier this year.
yeah.
Yeah, and those you can find at brandnamingbook.com and dbibook.com, respectively. They should be linked from that Heirloom Agency site, but they might not be yet. So, yeah, take a look. And I mentioned How Brands Are Built, the podcast as well. You can find that at howbrandsarebuilt.com. It's not just a podcast; it's also got lots of blog posts, and my bio there has links to all of this stuff as well. So I'm kind of spread out online and trying to focus. Yeah, that's why I think Heirloom Agency is kind of the central location, but you can find me all over the place. No, this was really fun. I loved all of your branding questions and how we could kind of nerd out on it, but also the way you diversified with your talent show portion and your rapid fire questions at the end. So I loved it. I will put you in touch with other people that I think would be great to be on the show. And I would encourage listeners to subscribe so that they can hear those future episodes.
Yay. Thank you so much, Rob. It was so much fun.